the most effective drug-seizing teams in the entire country. I said I wish I told them earlier, take them and put them in every major city in the country.
4:22 a.m. Minneapolis. Winter had sealed the streets under a skin of ice. Storefronts were dark, sidewalks empty, engines silent beneath layers of frost. In Cedar Riverside, a neighborhood of tight blocks and tall brick buildings, one office sat at the end of a narrow street, known to residents as a place of guidance and community leadership. Its windows glowed faintly through the cold. Down the block, a convoy rolled into place without sound. Black SUVs and armored vans slid into parking spaces, engines cut at the same moment. Doors opened in unison. Dozens of federal agents stepped onto the frozen pavement, breath fogging the air. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. Only quiet movement and clipped hand signals. A formation gathered at the front entrance. Heavy winter gloves wrapped around steel tools. One agent tested the door. It did not move. A breaching hammer swung forward. The first strike cracked the wood. The second split the frame. On the third, the door gave way. Agents surged inside, boots thudding against polished floors as flashlights carved through the darkness. The office looked ordinary at first. Framed photos. Shelves of binders. Letters from constituents stacked in neat piles. But teams moved with purpose, pulling vents, lifting panels, checking behind walls. Near the main desk, a false section of ventilation gave way. Inside were rectangular packages wrapped in tight plastic, stacked in a hidden compartment. 23 in total. Each one marked with the same stamped symbol. Not personal use. Not random. Inventory. In a steel safe bolted to the floor, drills cut through reinforced metal. When the door fell open, bundles of cash were revealed, banded and organized by denomination. The total reached into the millions. More money than a neighborhood bank typically kept on hand. On the desk above it all sat a satellite phone, still active. Its screen blinked with encrypted messages. Coordinates and coded instructions pointed far beyond the city, linking accounts and transfers to hubs overseas. This was not a single transaction. It was a channel. Outside, the neighborhood remained still. Inside, evidence teams moved carefully, cataloging every discovery. Computers were disconnected. Paper files were sealed into boxes. Each item was photographed and tagged. The office belonged to a senior public official long regarded as a bridge between communities. At public events, speeches had centered on safety, education, and opportunity. Behind the walls now being dismantled, something else had been operating quietly for years. Elsewhere in the metro area, additional teams were already in motion. Storage units. Small businesses. Warehouses with no signs on their doors. The same pattern appeared again and again. Shell companies, paper trails, money moving through accounts that looked legitimate on the surface. Financial analysts began to map the flow. Dozens of corporate names, all tied by signatures and approval stamps. Over time, tens of millions had passed through the network, routed through accounts connected to the same circle of people. Video recovered from surveillance systems showed a man entering rented basements and storage facilities late at night. Meetings were brief. No speeches. No gatherings. Just quick exchanges and quiet departures. 5 different phones rotated through his hands, each linked to a different set of contacts. By dawn, the scope of the operation was no longer in doubt. What had started as a discreet inquiry into financial irregularities had grown into something far larger. Shipments labeled as ordinary supplies were traced to containers that never reached their declared destinations. Cargo manifests no longer matched what was inside. In a command center miles away, maps were pinned to the walls. Red markers indicated properties, docks, and storage sites. Lines connected them like a web. Every route led back to a single cluster of buildings on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind a community facility that appeared quiet from the street. Plans were drawn quickly. Multiple agencies were brought in. Air support was requested. Timing was set to the minute. The objective was simple: move before anything could disappear. At 4:30 a.m., less than 20 minutes before the office door was forced open, the wider operation began. Helicopters lifted off from frozen fields. Drones swept low, scanning dark rooftops. Convoys rolled toward their targets, spreading out across the city. What had been invisible for years was about to be exposed. Armored vehicles reached the outer fence of the industrial complex as the sky began to lighten. Frost clung to the metal gates. When the first ram struck, sparks scattered across the ground. A second impact tore the hinges loose. The barrier fell inward and teams poured through the opening. Side doors were breached with controlled charges. A brief flash cut through the darkness, followed by the deep thud of steel giving way. Agents moved in lines, clearing corridors, sweeping corners, advancing one room at a time. The air inside was thick with chemical residue, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Beyond a set of reinforced walls, laboratories came into view. Stainless tanks, long tables, conveyor belts carrying sealed containers. Racks of chemical drums stood beside ventilation systems designed to hide heat and fumes. This was not a makeshift setup. It was a facility built for continuous output. Armed guards tried to slow the advance. Gunfire echoed off concrete and metal. The exchange was brief but violent. When it ended, several men lay on the floor, weapons pushed out of reach, hands secured behind their backs. Behind a triple-locked steel door, the core of the operation was found. More equipment. More product. Security panels showing camera feeds from across the property. Radios tuned to encrypted channels. Nearby, crates of ammunition were stacked beside body armor, arranged as if for immediate use. In a smaller room, a wall of screens displayed maps of the region. Dots marked warehouses, river docks, storage units, and truck depots. Lines connected them in precise routes. This was not a hiding place. It was a transportation network. One photograph drew attention. A uniformed police sergeant stood smiling, shoulder to shoulder with men already in custody. The image had been pinned in place as if it were a reminder of protection. As the final areas were cleared, the operation shifted from entry to documentation. Evidence teams moved in, sealing off rooms, photographing every surface, every label, every handwritten note. Metal cabinets were opened. Inside were folders with ordinary titles: community programs, youth services, development grants. But inside each file were transaction records. Transfers approved in minutes. Six-figure sums moving through accounts in the middle of the night. Financial specialists compared permits with bank logs. A pattern formed quickly. A city council member had signed multiple approvals in less than 15 minutes. A police captain received consulting fees on the same day certain shipments passed through his district. A medical clinic had billed nearly $2 million for services that never occurred. An elderly clerk who had processed some of the paperwork stared at the numbers in silence. She had believed the forms were for community projects. The signatures were real. The stamps were official. The money had gone somewhere else. In another room, long tables held satellite images printed in high resolution. Each image showed a different location tied to the same chain of movement. Handwritten notebooks listed monthly payments to individuals inside public offices. Some amounts were small. Others were not. Emails recovered from seized servers carried short instructions. Approvals. Delays removed. Inspections waived. Every message was a small part of a larger machine. By late afternoon, a meeting was called inside the temporary command center. Senior investigators and prosecutors stood around a single table. The evidence was stacked in boxes along the walls. What emerged was not the picture of a lone offender. It was a structure built quietly over years, embedded inside institutions meant to serve the public. Outside, the city continued its routine. Traffic moved again. Store doors opened. But behind yellow tape and sealed entrances, something fundamental had shifted. As daylight spread across Minneapolis, the reality of what had taken place overnight began to surface. Streets that looked ordinary from a distance carried quiet signs of disruption when seen up close. Yellow tape hung across familiar doorways. Federal seals covered glass entrances that had once been open to anyone who walked in for advice, paperwork, or help. Residents slowed as they passed. Some took out phones. Others just stood and stared. The buildings involved were not abandoned warehouses on the edge of town. They were places people knew. Offices where meetings had been held. Rooms where donations had been collected. Facilities where families had volunteered their time. Morning newspapers landed on front steps earlier than usual. The headlines were blunt. Dozens of locations searched. Vast quantities of illegal material seized. Tens of millions in cash removed. For many readers, the figures were difficult to understand. It was not only the size of the numbers. It was where they came from. In small cafes along Cedar Avenue, customers spoke in lowered voices. Some recognized the addresses listed in the articles. Others remembered attending events inside those buildings. The idea that such activity could operate behind walls that had always seemed harmless was unsettling. At a neighborhood diner, a group of older men sat around a table near the window. Heavy winter coats hung on the backs of their chairs. One unfolded a newspaper and laid it flat. He pointed to a photograph showing a familiar brick structure now surrounded by vehicles and uniformed personnel. No one spoke for several seconds. Then someone asked how long it had been going on. No one had an answer. Across the city, the effects spread quietly. A small bank branch in the northern district closed for several days after its director was taken into custody. Customers arrived to lock doors and handwritten notices taped to the glass. Inside, auditors worked through stacks of records, tracing transfers that had once seemed routine. At schools, parents lingered longer than usual in parking lots. Some remembered delivery vans that had come and gone months earlier. At the time, they had assumed the trucks were carrying supplies. Now those memories felt different. Investigators continued to work behind secured doors. What they found was not a series of isolated bribes. It was a system. Permits approved with unusual speed. Payments labeled as consulting fees. Grants issued to organizations that existed only on paper. One spreadsheet revealed a council member in a nearby suburb had signed 6 separate approvals in 12 minutes. Another showed a police captain receiving monthly payments that matched the timing of certain shipments moving through his district. A medical clinic had billed the city for services that never appeared in patient records. An elderly clerk who had worked in City Hall for decades was brought in to review some of the paperwork. She had processed many of the forms herself. As she looked at the numbers, her hands began to shake. The applications had been filled out correctly. The signatures were real. The stamps were official. She had believed she was helping fund youth programs and health services. Instead, the money had been routed somewhere else entirely. In a separate evidence room, maps covered long tables. They had been printed from satellite imagery and marked with careful precision. Warehouses, storage units, dock facilities along the river. Each location was connected by a thin line, forming a network that stretched far beyond city limits. Handwritten notebooks were stacked beside the maps. Each page listed names and amounts. Some figures were small, a few $100s. Others reached into the tens of thousands. Next to several entries were dates that matched recorded shipments and bank transfers. Email servers recovered from the complex told the same story in a different form. Short messages. Direct instructions. Approve the transfer. No inspection. Warehouse ready. None of them explained what was being moved, but together they showed how easily normal procedures had been bypassed. By late afternoon, senior officials gathered in a temporary command center. Boxes of evidence lined the walls. Screens displayed charts and timelines. The lead prosecutor addressed the room with a steady voice. The focus, she explained, was not on a single individual. It was on a structure that had been operating inside public institutions for years. Outside, the city tried to return to routine. Traffic moved along icy streets. Store doors opened. Buses ran their routes. But something had shifted beneath the surface. People noticed the absence of familiar faces in certain offices. They noticed the silence where activity had once been constant. In residential blocks near the raided locations, neighbors stood on their porches longer than usual. Some compared what they had read in the paper. Others simply watched as investigators came and went. A retired teacher who had volunteered at one of the closed facilities spoke quietly to a local reporter. She remembered meetings about tutoring programs and after-school activities. She remembered believing the speeches given there. The feeling she described was not anger. It was disappointment. At the courthouse, small groups gathered on the steps. Some held signs asking for answers. Others came without anything in their hands, just questions. It was not a loud crowd. It was a subdued one, trying to understand how so many approvals and signatures could have been given without anyone stopping to look closer. Financial institutions across the metro area placed holds on accounts linked to the investigation. Transactions that had once moved freely were now frozen while analysts reviewed years of data. For some businesses, that meant sudden closures. For others, it meant employees arriving to locked offices and unanswered phones. In community centers not involved in the case, organizers worked to reassure families. Attendance at meetings dropped. Donations slowed. The trust that had held many programs together was suddenly fragile. Throughout the day, investigators continued to log evidence. Each document was scanned. Each phone was examined. Each account was traced. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the operation had relied less on secrecy and more on routine. Forms had been filled out. Payments had been approved. Shipments had been waved through. Everything had looked proper on the surface. As evening approached, news broadcasts replayed images of the overnight raids. Helicopters lifting off from frozen fields. Agents moving through smoke and dust. Doors being forced open. For viewers, it looked dramatic. For those who lived near the locations, it felt close and personal. In apartment buildings and single-family homes alike, people locked their doors earlier than usual. They checked in on neighbors. They talked about what they had seen and what they had missed. The raids were over, but the sense of certainty that had once surrounded local institutions was gone. What remained was a city trying to understand how something so extensive could have grown quietly in places built on public trust. Over the next several days, the investigation moved from the field into courtrooms and analysis rooms. Evidence that had been pulled from safes, servers, and storage lockers was now spread across long tables under bright lights. Specialists in finance, logistics, and communications worked side by side, comparing timelines and tracing patterns that had been hidden for years. Every permit, every transfer, every shipment was placed in sequence. What had once looked like separate decisions now aligned into a single, continuous flow. Trucks moved through certain districts on the same days payments were approved. Containers left the docks within hours of inspections being waived. Nothing had been random. Prosecutors began building cases, not just around individuals, but around how the system had been allowed to function. It was not a matter of one office being misused. It was multiple layers of approval failing at the same time. Public records were pulled from city hall and county offices. The signatures were familiar. The stamps were official. The dates matched the movement of money and cargo. Some officials were called in for questioning. A few arrived with attorneys. Others came alone, carrying folders and notes, hoping they could explain what they had signed and why. Some said they had believed the paperwork. Others admitted they had stopped asking questions when payments began to appear. The reach of the network became clearer with each interview. Small businesses that had seemed ordinary were revealed to be little more than pass-through accounts. Community organizations that had received large grants had forwarded most of the funds elsewhere. Even charities had been used as cover. In one case, a youth outreach program had been awarded tens of thousands of dollars for after-school activities. Attendance records were minimal. Equipment purchases were never delivered. The money had been transferred out within days. Bank analysts followed the trail beyond state lines. Accounts in other cities. Transfers to foreign financial centers. Shell companies layered over shell companies. The complexity was deliberate. Each step was meant to make the next one harder to trace. Inside the city, the impact continued to grow. A police captain was placed on leave. A city council member announced a temporary withdrawal from public duties. A local business owner closed his doors after learning his accounts had been frozen. Residents watched these developments with a mix of shock and confusion. Names they recognized from community meetings were now appearing in legal filings. Places they had trusted were being described in terms usually reserved for crime scenes. Local leaders held briefings to calm concerns. They spoke about cooperation with federal authorities and the importance of transparency. But the uncertainty remained. People wanted to know how deep the problem went and how many layers of approval had been compromised. In the neighborhoods closest to the raided sites, the changes were subtle but noticeable. Traffic slowed near sealed buildings. Patrol cars were seen more often. Conversations at grocery stores and laundromats centered on the same questions. Investigators continued to review communications recovered from seized devices. Text messages and emails revealed how easily procedures had been bypassed. A simple line such as "no delay" could move a shipment forward. A single approval could release thousands of dollars. One series of messages showed a warehouse being cleared for use without any inspection. Another detailed the timing of a truck arriving just hours after a permit was issued. The system did not require elaborate coordination. It relied on routine compliance. As more documents were reviewed, the picture became more complete. The network had grown gradually, expanding as each new participant realized there were benefits to cooperating. Some received direct payments. Others received favors, contracts, or political support. The lead investigators met regularly to assess what had been found. Charts on the walls grew more complex. Lines multiplied between locations, accounts, and names. It became clear that the operation had not depended on intimidation alone. It had depended on familiarity. People had trusted colleagues. They had trusted forms. They had trusted that someone else had checked the details. Public confidence, once shaken, was difficult to restore. Community groups canceled events. Donations slowed. Parents hesitated before enrolling children in programs that had once seemed beyond question. Media coverage continued, but the tone shifted from dramatic footage of raids to quieter reports about audits and hearings. The story was no longer about doors being broken down. It was about how easily doors had been left open. In city offices, staff worked through stacks of paperwork, looking for irregularities. Some found errors they could not explain. Others found patterns they wished they had noticed earlier. The investigation moved forward methodically. Each piece of evidence was added to a growing archive. Each interview filled in another gap. By the end of the week, the outline of the network was visible even to those outside law enforcement. It was not just a handful of corrupt individuals. It was a system that had operated quietly within the routines of public life. When the final wave of warrants had been served and the evidence rooms were filled, Minneapolis settled into an uneasy quiet. From the outside, the skyline looked unchanged, but inside the institutions that had been touched by the investigation, everything felt different. Courthouse hallways were crowded in the mornings as hearings were scheduled and records were filed. Reporters waited outside conference rooms, hoping for updates. Clerks moved stacks of documents from one desk to another, careful not to misplace anything that might become part of a larger case. For residents, the impact was more personal. People passed the buildings that had once hosted community meetings and saw them still marked with federal seals. Some stopped for a moment before continuing on. They remembered fundraisers, volunteer drives, and speeches given in those rooms. Now the doors were closed. A small bank branch reopened after several days, but its lobby was quiet. Customers spoke softly as they stood in line. Transactions that had once been routine now took longer as additional checks were made. The staff had changed. Familiar faces were gone. In schools and community centers, administrators met with parents to answer questions. They spoke about safeguards and new oversight. They explained how programs would continue. But reassurance was difficult when so much trust had been misplaced. At neighborhood gatherings, people talked about what they had seen in the news and what they had experienced themselves. Some admitted they had noticed unusual activity but had not thought much of it at the time. Others said they had assumed someone else was responsible for checking. The investigation itself continued quietly. Financial trails were still being followed. Additional accounts were being reviewed. Each discovery added another layer to the story. In one case, a small nonprofit was found to have received repeated transfers far beyond what its programs required. In another, a contractor had been paid for construction that never occurred. Each detail showed how easily normal processes could be turned into channels for something else. Federal agents and analysts worked long hours, piecing together years of records. They were not just looking for what had happened but how it had been allowed to happen. Outside the city, officials in other jurisdictions began reviewing their own procedures. They wanted to know if similar patterns might exist elsewhere. The case in Minneapolis had shown how routine approvals could be used to hide extraordinary activity. In the weeks that followed, some of those implicated were brought before judges. Courtrooms filled with observers. The proceedings were careful and formal. Each charge was read. Each document was entered into the record. For the families of those involved, the process was painful. They sat quietly in the back rows, listening as familiar names were spoken in unfamiliar contexts. In the neighborhoods affected, life slowly adjusted. Some businesses reopened under new management. Some programs were restarted with new oversight. Others remained closed, their futures uncertain. People continued to ask the same question: how could so much have happened in plain sight? The answer was not simple. It lay in the way trust had been distributed across layers of paperwork and authority, with no single person seeing the whole picture. A retired city employee, watching the developments from her living room, said it felt like the city had lost something intangible. Not just money or property but a sense of reliability. Still, there were signs of resilience. Neighbors organized meetings to discuss how to rebuild. Volunteers offered to help programs that had been disrupted. People checked on one another more often. The investigation had exposed weaknesses, but it had also shown how quickly a community could come together when those weaknesses were revealed. As winter continued, the city moved forward, cautious but determined. The buildings would eventually reopen or be replaced. New officials would take office. New systems would be put in place. The events that had unfolded in the early hours of that cold morning would be studied for years. Not for their spectacle, but for what they revealed about how easily ordinary processes could be turned to extraordinary ends. The question of trust remained. It was no longer something taken for granted. It was something to be examined, tested, and rebuilt. Minneapolis stood in that space between what it had been and what it would become next, carrying the weight of what had been uncovered and the responsibility of deciding what came after.